I mean, all I felt was a weird pain in my abdomen, and then within minutes I couldn't stand and started going blind. And then my dead father was talking to me. I mean, it was crazy. And it was a beautiful day in June, and I had zero warning.
I remember listening to your interview with Tim Ferriss, and you had gotten to his house early and you were reading or something. And I remember you guys briefly talking about Seneca, which you'd said you hadn't read, you were flipping through. Did you ever get back around to picking up Letters of a Stoic?
I did. And I read it right after that, actually. And I underlined a whole bunch of stuff. But it was long enough ago that I don't think I can have an intelligent conversation about what I underlined. Unfortunately,
right.
But I was a huge admirer of. I mean, I was really. I mean, I was reading passages to my wife, which might be an abuse of marriage, abuse of the marriage contract. But I was reading him aloud to my wife.
No, it is fitting. Seneca talks in one of the letters. He talks about how the mind, if not given relaxation, will break, and he says we must go on wandering walks, which did remind me of your wonderful new book.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Yeah.
Well, I read two books before I read yours that sort of informed my reading. Maybe people have brought this up to you, but I stupidly reread Cormac McCarthy's The Road at the beginning of the pandemic. And then I also recently read a book, which you might not have read. I don't know if I have it here, called, here it is. Let me grab it. Called Lincoln on the Verge, 13 Days to Washington. And it's about Lincoln's train trip from Illinois to DC.
Wow.
And all, he has to stop in all these towns. But Lincoln was one of the early proponents of sort of American infrastructure. So it's this sort of journey along the canals and railroads.
Right.
But I'd first heard of a bunch of the towns that you talk about in this book because he passes through them in this insanely inefficient journey from the west to the east.
Right. Oh, fascinating. Yeah, I haven't read that book, but I'm a huge admirer of Cormac McCarthy, and I'm not sure The Road was his best book, but everything he's written I think is pretty stunning.
Yeah, I think it's certainly his best book if you have young children, and it's or worst, depending on how you want to categorize it. It's best and worst, and it was again the best and worst book to read in I think April of 2020 as the world is falling apart. But there were scenes in here where you're just chilling out under an underpass and someone takes a shot at you for no reason. That kind of reminded me of the dark insanity of human beings.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was this interesting, I mean, I've done a lot of backpacking in the wilderness, in the woods, whatever. What was interesting about this is that it was such a raw physical existence. We walked 400 miles along the railroad lines, but it wasn't wilderness. I mean, some of it was wild. Some of it was urban ghetto. It was, or mixed use industrial suburbs. I mean, it was sort of every flavor of American landscape. And the thing that really intrigued me about this particular trip along the rail lines, I called it the last patrol, was precisely that it wasn't in the wilderness. It was, we went right through and right around the edges of American society. We were dependent on American society for our food, but we had to avoid the police. We had to basically scoot through without getting into trouble. And that little game that we arranged for ourselves was just endlessly intriguing to me. I'm in New York and there's a lot of traffic outside. I'm so sorry that I could I could close the window if
I love it.
Obviously they're not Stoics out there on the street.
Well, so maybe you didn't get far enough in Seneca, but there is actually, let me see if I can pull this up. You might like this. Hang on one second. I don't know if I have a copy. Oh man, I don't. But there is a letter in Seneca where he speaks about being in this apartment in Rome, and he's trying to write, and he can hear the vendors shouting below. The police are arresting someone below his window. He's above a gym. He can hear the weights dropping. He can hear the fat men, being massaged. He describes, basically what's happening outside your window right now, minus the car horns.
Right.
And I think that is what I love about whether it's the road or Seneca or your thing, is that some of these sort of human experiences, are so sort of timeless, and the themes running through them, the dates and the places and the names change, but like, yeah, human being trying to have some quiet out their window, somebody going through a walk in unfamiliar territory. There is this sort of primalness that as much as we'd like to be gone, never does go away.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're primates, we're animals. Why would we haven't changed much in some thousands of years? Like, of course, it's all the same behaviors, and the sort of solipsism of our existence is always stunning to me. Like, we all get angry in traffic, and really angry sometimes, right? And I mean, and one day I was stuck in traffic, and I found myself just getting absolutely furious about it. And then I said to myself, "Listen, man, you're traffic too. Like, you're somebody else's."
Yes.
You're someone else's traffic. Like, don't get so high and mighty about the fact that you're stuck in that traffic. Like, you're in your traffic also. And once I thought of it like that, it actually allowed me to calm down. It was actually a great device for diffusing the anger that we all feel when we're stuck in traffic.
Well, and I think that what the Stoics would say, and I'm trying to find this passage because I marked it. You said the railroad lines we followed were there because that's where the settlers' roads had been. And the settler roads were there because that's where the Indian trails had been. And the Indian trails were there because 250 million years ago, the Juanita River had sawed her way through the shale and limestone strata of that country faster than the tectonic forces that could lift them up. It's not just that you're traffic. The Stoics would say, there's been traffic in this exact spot in some form, whether it's a train or a wagon train or hunter-gatherers or bands of marching soldiers. Traffic is traffic, and you're just one dot in a continuum of traffic in the same spots.
Right. And it's not all a conspiracy to ruin your day, which is how people experience traffic. It's pretty funny.
Epictetus said that philosophy wasn't this dry, abstract thing. It was a thing, he said, you should be talking about, writing down, reading about, exploring with other people all the time. He said, constantly have it at hand. That's how I think about philosophy. And it's weird. For the last 5 years, every single day I've been writing this free email about Stoic philosophy. It's been not just cool to meet all these fellow practitioners of Stoic philosophy, but in writing about it, talking about it, reading it for our podcast, I have got to internalize these ideas in a way that I never would have been able to under any other circumstances. That's the idea. Philosophy is something we're supposed to engage in, not keep in these dusty old books or read once and be done with. It's a constant process. And I think that's why the email has worked so well for the people reading about it and sharing it and talking about it, all of that as well. So I'd love to have you join us on this email. You can sign up at dailystoic.com/daily email. It's totally free, no spam. You can unsubscribe whenever you want. I've basically given away a book for free every single year for 5 years, and I'm going to keep on doing it until I drop dead. Check it out, dailystoic.com/daily email. Yes. And of course, right, you blame everyone else and you can't think about how you're contributing to the exact problem that you're bemoaning.
Right. I mean, the guy behind you is blaming you, right? I mean, it's quite funny.
So what is that darkness, though, that you experience on this walk? So I live out in the country about a bit outside Austin, Texas. So you sort of mentioned the ghetto. There's sort of also this kind of rural ghetto, which doesn't get as much attention. There is this experience I have every once in a while interacting with my neighbors or people out here where you go, oh, you live out here because you can't function in polite society, right? So you tend to have this idea of like sort of Southern hospitality or like, country manners. And then you also realize that some of these people live out away from everyone because they've been slowly exiled from polite society. It did seem that, the idea of just shooting at some total strangers who are sleeping under a bridge or walking down a trail, that's probably incomprehensible to some people, but also completely jives with my experiences.
Well, I have to assume that if he was shooting at us, he was trying to not hit us or he would have hit us. And
sure.
I think it was a kid with a revolver just emptied 5 rounds over our head because he didn't like the fact that strangers, out-of-towners, this is a small town in Pennsylvania, a lot of guns in Pennsylvania. I think there's often a certain view of outsiders that maybe isn't that great. And there we were looking dirty and ragged with backpacks and a dog and sort of squatting by our packs on the railroad lines. And I think he was like, why don't you guys move on to the next town? That would be a good idea. And that's how he communicated it. So, I mean, we'd all been in a lot of combat. And so bullets over our head will produce a certain reaction in all of us. But at the end of the day, I don't think it was any more threatening than a warning.
Yeah, it's. I think what it reminded me of the road, why it reminded me of the road, is you're on this walk, but you're deliberately having to sort of skirt society and skirt other people. And so, the theme of the book being freedom, we have this idea of freedom being sort of wonderful and welcoming, but actually freedom for you sort of depended on interacting with human beings as little as possible.
Yeah, and keep in mind that we all depend on others for our survival. The ultimate freedom is to be by yourself in the wilderness, but no one survives in the wilderness by themselves, right? The humans die immediately and very quickly. So to survive in the world, to survive on this planet, human beings need to be in some kind of group. And as soon as you're in a group, you have to abide by its rules or you're cast out of that group and your survival is in question again. So this idea of freedom as the sort of ultimate experience where you're completely unfettered in your actions is just nonsense. Like, I mean, yes, you can do that in the Canadian wilderness, but you'll only enjoy your freedom for some days or weeks.
Yeah. Did you read The Stranger in the Woods by Michael Finkel?
Yes, I did. Yeah.
Yeah. It sort of goes to your point, which is that his freedom, the hermit who lives in the woods, who sort of escapes from society, the only reason he's able to exist is because he steals from the same society that he's escaping.
Yeah, exactly. And, today the word freedom is thrown around a lot by people, with various kinds of politics. But what they're all forgetting is that all of those people, like every single one, is completely physically dependent on this very complex industrial society for everything that they need. And so the idea that you're free, there are forms of political freedom or whatever. Democracy is a form of political freedom. But the idea of being like free as in independent of all other systems that you don't have to answer to is just complete juvenile nonsense.
Yeah, that's kind of been one of the weird debates during the pandemic, right? I totally get why people would feel, minorly constrained, let's say, having to wear a mask or not being able to do this or that. And it strikes me as odd that our focus, though, has been on that and not on the global health crisis that has forced the constraint to begin with, right? Like, so yes, it's a constraint to wear a mask, but in not wearing a mask or in not sort of observing some basic safety protocols, then a large percentage of the rest of the population is now worried about dying of a disease. So the freedom is this thing that we throw around a lot. I think that's sort of what you're talking about in the book, but it's much more complex than whatever the thing the person wants to be free to do in that very moment.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. I mean, the word freedom, really, it means freedom from oppression. It doesn't mean freedom from obligation. And you're one of your primary obligations is not to endanger other people. So you are not free to run a red light. I don't care how important, quote, freedom is to you. You're not free to run a red light in this society where you depend on the infrastructure and the laws to get by in your life as well. You're not free to do that because you might kill somebody. And so if the group, in this case, the country, decides that you're endangering other people by not wearing a mask, you don't have to agree with them. You're part of this group, right? So you have to abide by that rule. And if you don't like it, you can leave. You don't have to be here, right?
Yeah, there's a big difference between driving without a seatbelt, which affects only you, and driving drunk, which externalizes the consequences of your actions on other people. At the root, I guess there's both freedom is at stake in both cases, but in your freedom to do one, you are implicitly depriving another person of freedom.
That's right. That's exactly right. And that's a distinction that I think is lost in some of the heated rhetoric these days around ideas of freedom.
Yeah, and you hear people say this like we all have different risk tolerances, which is true. We all have, some people feel comfortable jumping off a bridge of this height into the water, and other people,
Yeah.
would be at a lower height. The problem is when your risk tolerance is implicating or affecting other people.
Yeah, you can't choose other people's risk tolerances for them. So when you run a red light, you're running a huge risk yourself, but you're also choosing a level of risk for other people. And you're not allowed to do that. It's immoral and it's illegal, and it should be. So that's where your quote freedom ends.
I think one of my favorite scenes of the book, and this also jived from my experience. It's at the beginning. You're talking about how this guy asks if he can come with you, and you say no, you can't. And he says, "Oh, well, if you change your mind, let me know." And you point out that nothing was stopping this guy from leaving his front door and going on a walk himself. And I've found that on stuff that I've done, whether it was sort of moving out to the country to buy to live on a farm, or different decisions I've made, people will say things like, "I've always wanted to do that," as if financial constraints or a lack of financial constraints was why I was able to do that. When it's like, actually, this life that I have out here, I assure you, costs less than the average person's monthly rent in Manhattan. People often say they can't do something, they're not free to do something, when really it feels like that lack of freedom is an illusion, as it was for the guy who wanted to come with you.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. You're not willing to trade one thing for another. The usual trade is I want comfort and security, and I'm not willing to give those up in exchange for freedom and autonomy. And so I don't know who this guy was. We were walking along the rail lines of Pennsylvania. It was midwinter. It was very cold. There was snow on the ground. He was parked in a really old beater car along the railroad lines up ahead, and we stopped because we thought he might be a cop. It's illegal to do what we were doing. So we put some binoculars on him and watched him for a while, figured out he wasn't a cop. So we sort of walked on past him, and he engaged us in conversation. He was like, "Listen, I can be back here in 15 minutes with my gear if you'll let me come with you." And in my mind, I'm like, I mean, he was in his 70s, right? I was like, what is going on in your life where
Right.
like joining in midwinter, joining four guys you don't know, trekking along the road lines is better than what's going on at home. Like, are you okay? I didn't want to be part of his solution. But I also sort of noted in my book, I said, there's nothing stopping him from doing exactly what we were doing, walking out his front door and just keeping on going on the railroad lines till he hits the Pacific. I mean, there's nothing stopping him from doing that. But what I acknowledge, and this is where human sociability and interdependence comes in, there are some things that when you do them alone, they actually feel like a form of exile. And when you do them with other people, it feels like you're getting away with something or a form of freedom. And one of the things, in my book, I say, we walked 400 miles along the railroad lines, and most nights we were the only people who knew where we were. There's a lot of definitions of freedom, but surely that's one of them. Honestly, had I done this whole trek by myself, it wouldn't have felt like freedom. It would have felt like a gauntlet of fears and hardships that I might have been able to physically do, but it certainly would not have been as exhilarating as this sometimes was with this group of guys.
Well, this goes to the point of your last book, which is that if the tribe is doing it, it's a lot less scary than if we're doing it by ourselves. And our whole evolutionary process has been to want to be part of a tribe and to not be the exiled solitary figure.
Yeah, and as humans, your safety comes from the fact that you're part of a tribe that can defend itself, whether that tribe is the United States or the ancient Scythians or whatever it is, you can defend yourself, because otherwise you will lose your freedom to an outside aggressive force. But then the tricky thing is a society that can defend itself from an enemy is also capable of oppressing its own. So what you need to do is be in a society that's sufficiently guarded against outsiders, that it can defend itself, but you don't wind up with rulers, with leaders who want to oppress their own people. And that's the other part of freedom. What you end up doing is basically, as I say in the book, you change loyalty to one thing for loyalty to another. So in the early days of this country, people were often fleeing to the frontier to escape what they felt was the oppressive the oppressive scrutiny of the colonial government and then the American government. And on the Pennsylvania frontier, it was incredibly dangerous, right? I mean, it was Indian territory. There was no backup. Like, you were out there on your own with your family, and you didn't have the government breathing down your neck. But in order to survive that, you had to be part of a coalition of other farmers, other people in the community, settlers, that sort of had an agreed upon mutual defense. And that was the only way to survive the Indian Wars. But immediately, once you're part of that coalition, you have to respect the norms of that group. And one of the norms was that as a man, you had to, at all times, carry a flintlock rifle, a tomahawk, and a scalping knife. And if you were caught without those things at all times, you were shunned and shamed within the community. So pick your freedom, right? Do you want the freedom to not have to deal with the government, or do you want the freedom to not have to deal with neighbors who are going to cast you out because you're not abiding by their norms? There's no escaping the fact that you will have to obey group rules, or you run the risk of having a very short life.
It's funny how far back that tension goes. I was actually just rereading a new translation of Marcus Aurelius for an interview I'm doing next week, and I didn't notice the allusion before. But in Meditations, Marcus Aurelius alludes to Aesop's fable about the town mouse and the country mouse. Right? Each one thinks that the other's life will be better. They get it. They hate the country mouse is anxious in the city, and the city mouse is bored in the country. And it is funny, like, sort of, for all of time, people in small towns or small areas have rejected the provincialism and the oppressiveness of the small community where everyone knows their business, the tribe, as you said, that can tell you what to do. And then we get these big societies, the farming, the agricultural societies and the cities. And then that feels oppressive and isolating and alienating in its own way. And we crave the freedom of the tribe and the small town again. And so there's this, it feels like we're just pinging back and forth between these two extremes, never learning the lesson.
Yeah, we're toggling back and forth. And some people find the oppression of a large overarching state or government to be more oppressive than the oppression of a small community that's gossipy and can shame you and cast you out. I mean, there's no escaping some form of societal control. So pick your poison. But also, it's interesting that this sort of toggling back and forth between boredom and anxiety. I mean, that is the human condition, right? Like, and different people have different levels of each that they're comfortable with. Some people just cannot abide any boredom whatsoever. They're risk takers, right? Statistically, they live shorter lives. Young men have, I think, 6 times the mortality rate as young women, while in their early, years, 18 to 25, I think it is, 6 times the mortality rate, because, frankly, they're easily bored and they take stupid risks and they jump off of stuff that they shouldn't jump off of. They drive too fast. They do all kinds of they get in fights. They do all kinds of stupid stuff. They're definitely sensation seekers statistically compared to young women, and it gets them killed. So there you have people toggling back and forth between these two human evils, right? Boredom and anxiety. And, we all have to find our own middle ground.
Well, what's your middle ground? Because you seem like you chase these sort of romantic, although not always romantic, but these far-flung destinations, sometimes violent, sometimes war-torn, sometimes through the wilderness, like in this book. And then you live in New York City.
Yeah.
Where do you find that sort of stillness or the satisfaction that you need?
Well, when I was younger, I was a war reporter. Before that, I was a climber for tree companies. And I worked 80, 90 feet in the air sometimes with a chainsaw hanging on a rope, taking trees down in pieces. The interesting thing about tree work, unlike everything else, just about everything else, is that there's no random element. It's like there's no random element in chess. Like if you lose a chess game, you lost the chess game. There wasn't a roll of the dice, a draw of the card, right?
Sure.
And likewise in tree work, you're just dealing with physics. And if you top a tree out wrong and it comes back and falls on you and crushes you, you did that, right? There was no random element. In combat, there's a lot of random stuff in combat. I mean, I had a bullet hit a few inches from my forehead into a sandbag. from a guy who was shooting from 400 or 500 meters away. What's the angle on that saved my life? You don't even want to think about it. Totally random, right? So after one of my colleagues, Tim Hetherington, who died 10 years ago yesterday, I made a film called Restrepo with him. He was a dear friend, a wonderful guy. After he was killed in Libya, again, randomly, I got out of war reporting because I didn't want to it's one thing to take a risk with your own life, but I realized really you're taking a risk with everyone else's lives because you're going to devastate everyone who loves you for the rest of their existence. So you're really gambling with their lives, not with your own. And when I realized that, I got out. Now I have 2 young children, 2 little girls. So I don't even cross the street against the light. I'm like super, super cautious person.
Yeah, I would say the most devastating part of your entire book is that stream of consciousness letter from what's his name? Is it Michael Malin in the Irish jail? Yeah, I've got 2 young kids myself, and I just found that letter to be it just broke me. He's writing this sort of stream of consciousness letter to his wife as he's about their children as he's about to be let off to his death.
And let's make sure people understand he was in prison, tried for treason for being part of the rebellion against British forces in Ireland in 1916 during the Easter Rising. So he wasn't some street criminal he was trying to effect freedom, essentially effect freedom for his people. He was tried and executed for it. And this is the letter he wrote in the hours before his execution. When I read the audio version of this book, and when I read it in the studio, I started choking up. I choke up easily now because I have children. Like, it comes to me incredibly easily. But the director, who was sort of, like on the line with, not in the studio, but sort of on the line with me, she started just crying. And so, a century later, it's an incredibly powerful piece of writing.
Yeah, it's that was my experience rereading The Road as well. I finished it, 10 or 11 at night, and I just went into my 4-year-old's room and I just broke down and wept while he slept. That is an interesting tension, to go to your point about, you take these risks, you look for freedom, but the consequences of that risk are not evenly borne out. And that was sort of my reading on that letter. He's fighting for this thing that he believes in. He wants this freedom, but he knows that his freedom is not just a death sentence for him. It's a life of trauma for the people that he's leaving behind. And so there's really no way to sort of get freedom for free.
That's right. I had an unexpected and really profound run-in with that last summer. I almost died last June. I had an undiagnosed aneurysm in my pancreatic artery. Totally asymptomatic. It developed over decades, apparently, like not related to anything. I'm a very healthy guy. I'm an athlete. And one afternoon, without any warning, it ruptured. And I lost 90% of my blood into my abdomen. I just bled out. And it was really interesting. I'm an atheist. I'm not religious. My father was a physicist. He was an implacable rationalist, as am I. And as I was dying, they got me to the hospital. It took them over an hour to get me to the hospital. And I was, they cut my neck open and started trying to get blood into a vein to bring me back.
And this is during COVID in New York City, so I imagine response time is slow.
I was actually in Massachusetts, and it was a small hospital in Massachusetts, Cape Cod Hospital. They saved my life. They're small, but they were amazing. And I had no idea I was dying, none. At that point, my brain wasn't working very well, and so I don't even know if I could have understood that I was dying. What I knew was that I was getting pulled into a dark pit that was underneath me. That was how I experienced it. And then my father's dead. My father appeared and started comforting me. And I don't believe in anything, right? Nothing. And that I can't measure or see. And my father was, and I didn't want to talk to him. I sort of waved him away. And but here's the interesting thing: I didn't know I was dying. Like, what was he doing there? And the next day, the ICU nurses told me that I'd almost died, and it was sort of a miracle that I'd survived and all that. I mean, my blood pressure was 60/40. I mean, basically, I didn't have a pulse, and then it all came back to me, and it really has left me, the sort of atheist rationalist, with a really enduring question about what I experienced there, and I still don't understand it. But apparently, it's a very common experience for people who are dying and then obviously come back to have dead ancestors appear and try to help them with knowledge that the dying person actually doesn't really have on their own. Very mysterious thing.
That is very mysterious and also quite beautiful, as tragic as it is at the same time.
Yeah, and what was really traumatic to me was that you can be snuffed out of existence at any moment. I'm a healthy guy. I wasn't driving a car. I was in my driveway. I have a pulse of 60, whatever. I mean, I'm like, the idea that you can be taken out within an hour with no warning says something really fearsome about the universe. And the other part of it was none of it would have bothered me that much, except for my children and what they would have had to go through had I died. I mean, not to mention my wife, but particularly my children. That to me was just unbearable to think about. And that the real trauma of this, and it was traumatic. It was a lot more traumatic than my wartime experiences. The real trauma of this was rooted in that knowledge about my children.
Well, I carry a challenge coin in my pocket. Our video is a little blurry. I don't know if you can see it, but it has a quote from Marcus Aurelius on the back. On the front, it says memento mori, but on the back from Marcus Aurelius, he says, you could leave life right now. Let that determine what you do and say and think. And he actually has an exercise that he gets from Epictetus, one of the other Stoics. He says, and I try to do this in as uncreepy a way as possible. He says, as you tuck your children in at night, whisper to yourself, like you will not survive till the morning. Not you, he means them. Like that your kid might not run into your bed in the morning, at 4 a.m. That this could be the last time you do it. And there is a certain morbidity to that, especially when you realize, I think Marcus Aurelius had 6 children who did not survive to adulthood, including 2 sets of twins, which is just, unbelievable. But I think the point there is, like, don't rush through this. Don't take it for granted. Life is random, and you could be bleeding out at this very moment and have no idea.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, all I felt was a weird pain in my abdomen, and then within minutes I couldn't stand and started going blind. And then my dead father was talking to me. I mean, it was crazy, and it was a beautiful day in June, and I had zero warning. And the idea, it's terrifying that we can all be canceled by the universe at any moment.
Yes.
But what you get in return, from that is, if you allow it, a kind of wonderment in existence. Or at least that's what I've tried to get out of it. And it's a miracle that we're here. And I mean, I don't mean that in a religious sense. I mean, it's staggeringly unlikely that any of this would exist and that we're here to witness it. And yet we are. And the beauty of that thought can be so transcendent if you really stop and look around, like where you are right now, right at this moment, like, oh my God, look at this. I'm surrounded by existence.
Even the technology that we're talking to each other on is marvelous.
Yeah. But even at a more basic level, just the fact that you're conscious and looking at anything at all. Apparently in terms of the physics of all this, it was pretty unlikely that a universe would be created that would, forget about having stars and matter and all that, would create a kind of matter that can think about itself. That's insane, right?
Yeah.
And yet it did. And here we are. And that's true. And that you can hug your children. Like that other part of it, that can happen. Like, I'm like, okay, I'm good. Like, I don't want to die anytime soon, but here I am, and I'm going to squeeze the most I can out of every moment.
Well, I like that you use the word cancel there because, the sort of the bugaboo now, and people on both sides of the political spectrum are talking about it. We talk about this idea of cancel culture. And every once in a while, I'll catch myself thinking like, did I say something a long time ago? Did I do something embarrassing in high school and I could be canceled? But the truth is, like on the scale of random things to worry about, having your book deal taken away or having your platform canceled from you is probably not the freak black swan event that you want to take active steps to prepare against. You should be worried that you could get hit by a truck.
Yeah, or get ready for the abdominal hemorrhage that you didn't know about. For that matter, I just read a unbelievably terrifying article in Wired. Just came out just recently about what happened physically to the planet during the last major asteroid impact. Asteroid, meteor, I'm not sure which. At any rate, the one that killed all the dinosaurs.
Yes.
That could happen in any week, right? We don't know. We're not tracking everything.
Sure.
We might have, I think, a week or two of warning, and no one's going to survive. Like everything will be gone, right? And the physics of that are so horrifying. And so all of human endeavor, civilization is going week by week, right? And once you wrap your mind around that, your book deal doesn't matter so much.
Yeah, I spent some time thinking about that in March of last year. I sort of went back through the headlines and I thought, what were people really worked up about in December and January and February and even, the first week of March? I remember there was a story about, American Airlines or United Airlines, making a statement that they didn't want people to recline their seats on airplanes. And this was this huge controversy. People were very upset. How dare you try to take away, my 1 inch of extra space on a plane? And meanwhile, what's tracking in the background is the inability to fly at all for months and months and months. And so, we do tend to sort of think about a whole bunch of trivial nonsense. Meanwhile, existence itself could be taken from you like that.
Yeah, but that truth is too huge to keep in one's mind constantly. And if you can keep it in your mind a little bit, it can deepen your appreciation, your sense of gratitude about existence. I guess the word gratitude is the word. And I don't mean gratitude to God. If you want to use God for that go ahead, but you don't need to. It can just be a blind gratitude of the fact that you exist and have people around you who you love.
Let's talk about the power of walking really fast, because I'm a big believer in that. Every morning I do like a 3-mile walk with my 2 kids. My rule is I don't touch the phone. I don't bring the phone. So, whatever time I went to bed till when I get back from the walk, that's my sort of phone fast every day. And we go outside, we see the deer, we see rabbits, we watch the sun come up. My one piece of parenting advice to people with young kids is that walking will solve 90% of all child problems, right? And you briefly talk about this in the book, that there's something about it that just, it lulls them to sleep. It lulls you into a different headspace. Yeah. What do you learn walking hundreds of miles in the middle of nowhere, carrying heavy stuff?
Yeah. Well, first of all, humans are a very ambulatory species. Children are walking large, in hunter-gatherer societies, children, of course, there were no strollers or anything like that. So children by age 4 were walking all day. And by age 5 or 6 are carrying gear to help their community. So just, in terms of our society's dependence on things with wheels on them, children really don't need all that stuff, starting at a pretty young age. But, what we were doing, we didn't have children with us. We were carrying 60 or 70 pounds, which is a fair amount of weight. And what did I learn from walking? It's incredibly hard if you do it for more than a couple of hours. It really, really takes a toll on your body if you're carrying weight. Carrying weight really beats your legs up. But there are times when it gets very easy. And in my book, I talk about falling into a cadence with other people. And all of a sudden, it's a very identifiable moment, a very identifiable transition from the sort of minor struggle of putting each foot forward over and over and over again to all of a sudden it feels like it's easier to walk than to stop. And when it feels easier to walk than to stop, you're in cadence, and you can have that by yourself or with others. But if you're walking with other people, you feel carried along by their energy as well. Doing that with a group of people makes you very close to them. And the other thing that makes people feel very close is sleeping outside. I don't mean zipped up into little tents. I mean outside the way humans have always done it, under trees, under the stars, worried about what's out there in the dark, trying to figure out what are we going to do in the morning to cook breakfast. Like that kind of experience. If you can sleep outside with your children, with other people, the feeling of closeness that's engendered by that is absolutely extraordinary. And I think it's something that's actually missing from our modern society and that we miss quite a lot.
Yeah, I read a story over the summer about some fossilized footprints they found in White Sands National Park, where it's a set of footprints, and then every so often, for a few steps, there's children's footprints. And what they sort of recreated from this is that it was a father carrying a young child. And, they go, pick me up. And you carry them for a little bit. And they go, put me down. And then they make it 3 feet. And then they go, pick me up. And it was amazing that they were able to even track from the size of the footprints, like how old the kid was, that they were traveling at roughly 4 miles an hour for short bursts. And you just go, human beings have been doing this thing for as long as there have been human beings, and that we're evolved for this, and that it's connecting us to some sort of deeper primal experience that's kind of washing away the dust of modern life in a really meaningful way, I think.
We've never had a stroller.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, of course, strollers are a pretty recent invention. They needed pavement had to be invented first, obviously. But I have a 1.5-year-old that I sort of can put on my chest, and I have a 4-year-old that goes on my shoulders, and that's less than I was carrying on my 400-mile walk on the railroad lines. And so if we have to go anywhere, either the 4-year-old walks, or she climbs up onto my shoulders, and I can walk all day long like that if I have to. And I have to say the pleasure of human contact, of touch, particularly with your children, of just being physically close to them, particularly when they're really young, when they're 1 year old. I mean, the fact that your child is right next to your heartbeat. All of that visceral touch stuff is so rich, it's so good, and it's so ancient. And, one of the things I realized about modern parenting is that essentially the more you separate the parent from the child physically, the more you can monetize that relationship. So if you don't carry your child, you need a stroller. And then, of course, a company can sell you a stroller. If you don't sleep with your children in your bed, you need a cradle, you need another room, you need a video monitor. All that stuff can be monetized. And if you go to the core parenting experience, human parenting experience, there's no way for a company that wants to sell you something to get inside that relationship. You have to stop breastfeeding. Now you have milk formula, whatever. They can break that relationship up in a lot of different ways. And, there's a lot of very good reasons to use that stuff. But for the most part, it's for the convenience of the parents, not for the good of the child. Like, for the most part, what you were trying to do is allow parents in this very harried, hectic, overcommitted Western society to carve out a little bit of autonomy and time for themselves, because frankly, they need it. But none of us should be under any mistake that it's like better for the kids. Like the kids that, my daughter would, she doesn't want to be in a stroller. She wants me to ride on her daddy's shoulders. It's very, very sweet.
Yeah, the Silicon Valley term for that is disintermediation, and that the genius companies disintermediate relationships and then act as the middleman, and you can charge whatever you want to be the middleman.
Right, exactly. I mean, in the 60s, I think it was, or the 70s, there was a big campaign, I believe it was by Nestle, to convince mothers that breastfeeding was actually bad for the children, like unhealthy for the child to breastfeed, because they wanted to sell the milk formula. I mean, that's insane. I mean, The species is several 100,000 years old. We got here somehow, and we did pretty well getting here. Like the idea that Nestle knows better than human evolution is just so laughable and insulting. And yet they made, millions, billions of dollars off it.
No, laughable is the right word. I remember a few years ago, my mom found like an old photo album, and they had a photo of her and me right after I was born, and I was drinking out of a bottle. And I said, what am I doing? Drinking out of this bottle. I'm like 20 minutes old. She's like, oh, the custom then is that the doctor, you would give the baby water, like a bottle of water, like in a kid's, it struck me how absurd that was. That for hundreds of thousands of years before bottles were invented, how were kids getting this water? Right? They weren't.
Right.
This is a random theory that's obviously no longer in vogue, but just how random some of this disintermediation is, and how far it takes us from where we probably should be.
Yeah, and you could look at social media as a massive example of that. It's replacing what people used to do face to face in a circle. And now you put a bunch of people face to face in a circle and they're all looking down because there has been a process that has gotten inside that one-on-one relationship and basically monetized it. I have a flip phone. I refuse to have a smartphone. I'll prove it. There it is. I refuse to do that. Right. And I find it, watching people's behavior around their smartphone, I find it really depressing. Like, I feel like, my God, what a lonely species we've become. It really bothers me.
Yeah, I think we often see things as an obligation that are actually a gift. Like my oldest son, he never napped. He refused to nap in a bed. He would only nap if he was in some form of movement. So he'd nap in the car, he'd nap in a bike trailer, he'd nap in a stroller, or he'd nap in a baby carrier. And so that became this thing where I would have to do most of the nap. I would put him in a running stroller and I'd go for a run, or I'd put him in the bike trailer and I'd go for a ride. And I did the math a few months ago, and it's like, we've done like 4,000 or 5,000 miles together, probably the equivalent of what like an Apache family would have done over the same period. But that bond I wouldn't trade for anything. And it's so much deeper than essentially any other, even though the vast majority of it was in silence and the vast majority he wasn't even awake for, that bond is irreplaceable.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that was one way to get through life peacefully and happily, is to understand that it's possible that the things that are challenging and difficult and hard are actually have an upside that you're just not aware of. And that's a really cool trick for getting through things that are just objectively difficult.
Well, I would agree. I have a tattoo on this arm that says "The obstacle is the way," which I wrote a book about. That Marx really says the impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. And I think you look at those things as challenges that make you better, and it becomes true. You look at them as obstacles that deprive you of something, and it also becomes true.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So I want to talk about writing really fast. I've never read one of your books and thought that could be shorter, right? You seem to only use no words where two, where someone else might use two, even sort of like, I have a galley of this, but it's what, like 150 pages? I can't imagine. Your publisher probably expected it to be longer. For you, is it just about boiling things down to their very essence? Is that sort of where you come from as a writer?
I love efficiency, and I feel like there's a kind of beauty in efficiency. And you can make a case for being the comprehensive last word on a topic. I would want the biography of Lincoln to be a doorstop of a book. An honorable man who played a crucial role in American history. I just want to make sure everything about him is documented somewhere, right? That's not the kind of writer I am. For me, people are busy. They have other good stuff to do, stuff that might be better for them than reading a book. And so, but the ideas that I write about, I feel are important, and to people personally and to our society as a whole. So I haven't always done this, but recently in my book Tribe and in Freedom, I've tried to just get in and out. Like, what's the minimum amount people need to know about this topic in order to understand it, and then to continue thinking about it on their own, in their own terms. I don't have to do all of that thinking for them, right? I just need to start the conversation so that they can, after they read my book, see the world in a slightly different way and continue that conversation with themselves or with others. And that's why you can read my, there's a kind of book where you can read on the Amtrak train from New York to DC. That's a 2-hour trip, right? And there are books that you can read on that trip, and that, like, sometimes that's the kind of book I want to write.
No, I'm the same way, and I think there's an accidental sort of marketing trick there, which is people think they burned through it because it was so good, right? They never go like, "Oh, that's a really short book." They go, "It was amazing. I read it all in one sitting." And you're like, "Well, I don't want to spoil it, but it's half the length of a normal book." Right. That's why.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think there's also, on some level, even unconsciously, the reader is like, and I'm a reader too, right? I mean, I read other people's books, but I think the reader is like, thank you for not making this too long, right? So that, I want a book that could fit in a back pocket and you can read in a couple of hours. And there's other kinds of books that require more than that, obviously. And one of the things it means two things. It means that you're very careful about the content that needs to be known. Some things need to be known, other things don't. But you're also very careful about being efficient with your prose. And you can really squeeze the excess out of a book or out of an essay by just being pretty ruthless about excess wording.
You're another great example of something. I got really good advice at the beginning of my career. Someone said, writers live interesting lives. And I feel like every one of your books is rooted less in some, creative, breakthrough, and more an experience that through that experience, you came to the breakthrough and are communicating what you learned. So, people think they need to go to school to be a writer, or they think they need, a scoop or something. When really, I feel like if you have experiences, that drives writing that's worth reading.
Yeah, and I'm, keep in mind, I'm a journalist. Like, I started out as a journalist. My job, as I saw it, was to write about the world as it was unfolding around us. And that the last honorable topic was me. Like, that I'm not the point of any story. I mean, occasionally sure. I pop up in the first person, but that's invariably because I think a first person, for a moment, for a paragraph or what have you, a first person perspective will allow the reader to understand what I'm writing about in a more immediate way. But what you don't want to be is, you don't want to be the only person on stage. Like, you don't want to be the only person if you write in the first person, you don't want to be the only person that you're talking about. You want to be writing about yourself as your experience illuminates other people. And you want to be really, really cautious that the overall topic of the book is not you. Like, you're the least interesting thing on the planet. Or you have to try to see it that way. And that everything else deserves the respect of a full treatment. And you really come at the very, very end of the line.
Yeah, I heard a great expression that all bad writing is essentially a love poem to oneself.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. That's good.
Is there a weird tension for you? And I guess maybe I'm projecting, but I feel a little bit, you go and you do all this hard stuff, often this dangerous stuff. And then there's another part of you that is a poet, that does love words, or you wouldn't be doing this profession, right? I sometimes laugh at the sort of image of, like a hardcore rapper, it's this big tough guy projecting this image, and it's like, but you picked poetry as your profession. Like, you picked singing and poetry. And sometimes I love to imagine, like, your most hardcore rapper like doing vocal exercises backstage, you know, like me. Like I sometimes love, you know, Hemingway cultivates this probably more than any other writer, the image of the writer as the tough guy. But I mean, deep down, we're nerds and we love books.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's in our society a false distinction between intellect and toughness, and I think that's probably because of the universities and the academies. You know, it's like route people into careers where you wear, you know, like a tweed jacket with leather patches on the elbow. Yeah. You know, there's no reason, and the Greeks understood this perfectly well. There's no reason that the intellect and physical toughness can't be paired. In fact, one should insist that they be paired, actually. And you don't have to be a big, strong dude to be tough. Stephen Hawking was a very tough guy, and he couldn't get out of a chair. You know, toughness basically means you have courage, and that you're not thinking about yourself foremost. And that can fit into any size body, any kind of person.
Yeah, that's right. That's a good way to think about it. Is and it's not. I mean, it's an easy job in the sense that you sit in a chair. But I also find that my sort of experience with endurance sports is what I draw upon when I'm 2/3 of the way through a manuscript that I'm starting to think might suck.
Oh yeah, I mean, I was a really competitive runner in high school and college and afterwards, and you know, the most painful things I've ever done were really intense races. I when I was a kid, I ran a 4:12 mile, and I ran a pretty good marathon. And you know, later in life, I would just think like that same switch in your mind where you try to disconnect from your experience of suffering. I would try to apply that to all the other things that people suffer through in their lives. And, you know, it doesn't always work, but certainly when you're trying to finish a manuscript or something on deadline or whatever, it doesn't matter what it is. I could access that sort of athlete part of myself that got practiced at ignoring pain. And I could apply it in almost any way.
Yeah, you talk about the little trader in your head that you want to make deals with in the book. You know, that you have to, I think as a runner or a biker or, you know, basically any physical activity, you learn that voice is a fucking liar and that it's telling you that you're hitting your breaking point and actually you got quite a bit left in the tank.
Oh, yeah. And by the way, trader, just so that your listeners realize that trader as in treason, not trader as in Trader Joe's. Both.
Both. You make little deals with yourself too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, he'll come crawling out of the woodwork at a moment's notice, like, "Hey, listen, just slow down a little bit, and then I'll make it up to you later." Or you can make it, you know, whatever. Yeah. And you just have to be so harsh on that dude. Really, I mean, you don't start talking to him because as soon as you do, it's over, and you have to be quite implacable about it. And the reward that you get is that if you really reject that awful little voice, you can get to a stage of physical effort or even exhaustion where you're suddenly free of the experience of effort. And some of the times, either running or walking on this long trek that we did, where I felt that was physically the easiest, occurred during times when I was the most exhausted. And all of a sudden, it was almost like a beam of light came down from the heavens. And again, I'm an atheist, but that sort of image comes to mind. And all of a sudden, I just felt nothing. And I felt like I could walk or run all day and all night. Like someone better stop me or I'm just going to keep going. And that to me is as close as I've come to a spiritual experience.
But so how did you know then in the moment where you get to Ohio and you're like, it's time to go home? Like, you know, Forrest Gump, you know, just magically stops running across the country at some point and realizes that he's done. How do you know that isn't the lie of all lies from the voice in your head? How does one know when to quit and when to push through?
Well, you know, for me, the traitor in your head tries to get it lures you in by trying to get you to slow down just a little bit because it thinks that's all you're going to accept. What happened to me at the end of this trip was that I'd spent a year avoiding the reality of my life, which was I was in the middle of a divorce. I was in a lot of different ways as a spiritually emotionally, psychologically in an extremely bad place. My buddy Tim had been killed. I had a lot of homework to do, and I had avoided it. And it was a good decision, but I'd avoided it for a year by doing this trip. And so what happened to me in Connellsville one hot summer day when we walked into Connellsville and soaked ourselves in the river, I realized it was going to take more courage. When I realized it would take more courage to go back and face my life than it would to keep walking, that was what I did. I still did the thing that was in some ways a lot harder and scarier, and that was actually going home.
So maybe that's what it is. It's like, hey, I don't know if I'm trying to back out of this wedding at the altar. I don't know if I'm trying to quit this manuscript, because it's a good idea or because I actually have a better idea. I don't know whether that maybe the test is the thing you're thinking about doing instead. Stephen Pressfield talks about the idea of the resistance. Is the thing you're doing instead, is it actually harder or easier? And then if you're thinking about quitting to do something harder, then at least you're not quitting this thing because it's hard.
Yeah, and harder in a different way. The last patrol that we did was physically very hard, but mentally it was lovely, right? I mean, going home and facing my life, and now I have a great life. I mean, I remarried. I have 2 little children. I mean, I did the right thing. I mean, it all worked, right? But I had to go home and face the emotional terrain of my life, and that felt harder in a different way. And in some ways, that's why I knew it was the right thing to do.
No, that's lovely. The last thing, and I'll let you go. I really nerded out in your book, and I read even the acknowledgments and the sources. And I saw your little conversation with Jack Weatherford. What an amazing writer he is. His book on Genghis Khan is incredible.
Unbelievable book. Yeah. Another book called Indian Givers of his that's fantastic about what I don't think it's the greatest title, but it's what the Native Americans gave to Western society. Incredible book.
I didn't know about that one. I've only read his 2 books on Genghis on the Mongols, so I'm going to read that one next. But I loved that he was answering your questions because I'm a big fan.
Oh yeah, he's a lovely guy. I exchanged emails with him, and he's a fantastic person.
Amazing, Sebastian. Thank you so much. I'm a huge fan. I loved the book, and it was an honor to chat.
Well, I really, really enjoyed it. Thank you for reading my book and having me on.